Penguin Random House Audio presents The Awkward Age by Francesca Segal. Read for you by Jayne Entwistle. Why does a mother need a daughter? Heart's needle, hostage to fortune, freedom's end. Yet nothing's more perfect than that bleating, razor-shaped cry that delivers a mother to her baby. The blood cord snaps that held their sphere together. The child, tiny and alone, creates the mother. A woman's life is her own until it is taken away by a first, particular cry. Then she is not alone, but a part of the premises, of everything there is. A time, a tribe, a war. Anne Stevenson, Poem for a Daughter. Part 1. Chapter 1. The teenagers would fuck it up. Certainly they always tried. It was the only impulse Gwen and Nathan had in common, besides their hostility toward one another. This morning the thought of waking her daughter filled Julia with a particular foreboding, despite her own excitement about the weekend. They were all going to America, to James's hometown, which Julia had imagined since meeting him. They had given one another their futures, but she was greedy for his past, too. She would never know him young, but knowing Boston seemed the next best thing, a way to make up the impossible, inconceivable deficit of all the wasted days spent not loving him before they'd met. She wanted to see the places that had mattered, to visit Harvard, where James had turned his tassel, had become a doctor, a husband, a father, had grown from unknown boy into the cherished man who now lay beside her, breathing steadily, face down in his pillow, in their bed, on the top floor of what was now their home, a narrow Victorian terraced house in Gospel Oak, North London. She was looking forward to Boston. On the other hand, this holiday meant 3 intensive days with Nathan, who would no doubt take every opportunity to needle her with casual reminiscence about the halcyon days during which his father had been married to his mother. Meanwhile, Julia's own daughter, Gwen, would be dependably more difficult. Such had been the way. James stared, smiling sleepily up at Julia, and hooked an arm round her waist. He drew her back to the horizontal and began to mumble into her hair. A muscled thigh fell over hers, hot and marble-heavy, and she was pinioned. "The cab's in an hour. We've got to get the kids up. I have to do the dog." He shook his head without opening his eyes. "Send the kids without us. Let's stay here. It'd serve them right for being pains in the rear end." On cue, a thudding bass began beneath them, too loud for the rest of the terrace at this or any hour. Nathan was awake. Impossible to rouse most mornings, he was home from boarding school. It seemed he could spring up before daylight when Boston, and an escape from her house, Julia suspected, lay ahead of him. Predictably, dispiritingly, Gwen's voice now rose, shouting a sleep-slurred obscenity. At the sound of so many humans unexpectedly awake during his early shift, Mole began to bark with joy. The thump of tail on wooden boards was followed by a frantic scrabbling outside their bedroom door. "Shut up!" they then heard, and the dog and the rest of Gwen's complaint were drowned out when Nathan turned up the volume. When will they start to be nice to each other? James had tipped forward and was fishing on the floor beside the bed for last night's t-shirt, bare buttocks in the air. "Probably never," he said cheerily from this position. "But we can get rid of them soon. College, the army, sell them into service." When this got no reply, he sat up again and said more gently, "Give it time. It hasn't been very long. It's a big change for both of them. Saskia's been civilized. Why is your daughter an angel when mine is being such a nightmare?" "Saskia doesn't have to live here," James pointed out. He was squinting at his watch. "Cab's in an hour and 20. Have I got time for a run? I'll take the dog." He was out of bed, flexing and yawning, and Julia paused to look at him. It was extraordinary that this man now shared her bed. He was broad-chested, solid, beautiful. At 55, he was still mostly blonde. He was tall and square in the way that only Americans are square, as if raised, corn-fed and free-range, on strong sunshine and red meat and the earnest and deliberate pursuit of happiness. Her English imagination placed him in dungarees on a tractor, a piece of straw between white teeth, or tugging on the brim of his cap as he swaggered up to bat on a sun-bleached baseball diamond, a mixing of metaphors inspired mostly by her admiration for his height and his shoulders. This visit to America would begin to set her imagery straight, and that he was, in reality, a Jewish obstetrician from a working-class neighborhood of Boston would remain a delightful incongruity. In surgical scrubs, he looked outsized and vaguely alarming. He saved women's lives. He saved Julia every day. When they met, she had been raising Gwen alone for 5 years, with the volatile intensity of hostages long held together. He had come to Julia for piano lessons, and she had found, over time, that her weeks began to shape themselves around his classes. He had an easy charm and made her laugh. With a series of caveats, she eventually agreed to coffee, ostensibly to discuss his musical progress, which was poor, if dogged. On their first date, timed to coincide with Gwen's geography field trip to study glaciated landscapes around Keswick, Julia had sat, prim and awkward and resistant, had spoken little but had drunk a great deal of red wine, and had eventually launched herself upon James in the taxi home with an alarming and volcanic hunger, and had spoken her first honest, unguarded words to him, hungover and ashamed the next morning. This was an English first date, as she remembered it. To James, its speed affirmed his growing conviction that they were meant to be together. For they were meant to be together. He was all she'd never dared to want. Until that time, Gwen had been absently polite when James arrived each week. Just another of her mother's students traipsing to the first-floor music room with Chopin nocturnes and a mediocre handspan, but overnight had sworn him mortal enemy, blood-deep rival, her father's bitter adversary, and her own. She had lost one parent, and would not yield her mother without a fight. Julia feared Gwen, and feared for her, and had never before withstood her daughter's rages. But she had uncovered a new, accidental source of strength. She had fallen in love. Despite the obstacles, James brought sunshine, and she had begun to believe, with his help, that her own happiness could start to heal her daughter. This new relationship was entirely different from her marriage, and for that she was grateful. It made it simpler somehow to find for James a chamber in a heart that had for so long been only Gwen's. James encouraged Julia to relax, to take him for granted, to believe that he was hers to grow old with. But she would not. Such wasteful complacence would be unforgivable when their luck was too extraordinary. That their two fragile human hearts continued to beat each hour, she knew to be a miracle. Joy was a passing alignment of stars, a flash of sun burning gold flames on water before the clouds came. Julia knew life to be a series of calamities. She waited for the piano to fall, the tornado to strike, and in the meantime, her own pure happiness thrilled and frightened her. If only Gwen didn't hate him so much. Julia came down to find both children already in the kitchen, still in pajamas, still deftly, stubbornly ignoring each other. Nathan stood spooning porridge into his mouth before the open fridge door.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?